Hello and welcome to What Buddha Really Taught, a channel dedicated to uncovering the original teachings of the Buddha, based on the most authentic sources from the early Buddhist tradition. If you've ever wondered what the Buddha actually said, not centuries later, not after layers of myth and ritual, but what he really taught, in his own words, you're in the right place. In today's episode, we're going to explore a question that has puzzled many. Was the Buddha a real person, or just a legend? Let's find out. Part 1. Was the Buddha a real person or just a legend? Have you ever wondered? Was the Buddha a real person? Or was he just a mythical figure like a wise sage from an ancient fable, meant to teach us moral lessons but never truly existed? It's a question more people ask than you might think. Many of us grew up seeing statues of the Buddha in temples, in quiet gardens, or even in meditation apps, serene, peaceful, with eyes half closed, sitting still under the Bodhi tree. But how many of us have asked, did he really walk this earth like you and me? Was there truly a man named Siddhartha Gautama who left his royal life in search of liberation? Not just a symbol, a historical human being. According to early Buddhist scriptures preserved in the Pali Canon, the most ancient and reliable source of Buddhist teachings, the Buddha was not a god, nor a mythical being. He was a human being, born in the 6th century BCE in a small kingdom called Kapilavatthu, located in what is now the border region of Nepal and India. His name at birth was Siddhartha Gautama, Sanskrit, Siddhartha Gautama. He was born into a noble family, the Sakyas, but renounced his wealth and title in his late 20s to seek the end of suffering. But can we be sure he existed? This is where history meets archaeology. In the 3rd century BCE, about 200 years after the Buddha's death, Emperor Ashoka of India, a devout Buddhist, erected stone pillars across the Indian subcontinent, marking important sites from the Buddha's life. One of these pillars stands in Lumbini, now in Nepal. The inscription on this stone pillar explicitly states, "Here the Buddha, the sage of the Sakya clan, was born." This is not folklore. It's a historical inscription made by a ruler known for spreading Buddhism far beyond India's borders. And modern archaeologists agree that these inscriptions provide solid evidence that the Buddha was a real historical figure. What did the Buddha say about himself? Interestingly, the Buddha never claimed to be divine. In fact, in many suttas from the Pali Canon, he emphasized his humanity. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha is quoted as saying, "I am awake." He didn't say, "I am God," or "I am a prophet." He simply said he had awakened to the truth of existence just as anyone else can, with effort. In fact, one of the most striking things about early Buddhism is how rational and grounded it is. The Buddha constantly advised his followers not to believe something just because he said it. In the famous Kalama Sutta, he said, "Do not go by hearsay, or by tradition, or by authority. But when you know for yourselves that something is unwholesome, abandon it. And when you know something is wholesome, cultivate it." This is not the voice of a myth. It's the voice of a teacher deeply concerned with how people live and suffer in the real world. So why the doubt? It's understandable that people question the Buddha's existence because over time, layers of myth and symbolism were added around his life. Stories of him walking 7 steps at birth, or his body glowing with light, these are later additions, often meant to express reverence, not historical fact. But beneath those layers, history shows us a real person. A seeker. A wanderer. A man who gave up everything in search of the end of suffering and then spent 45 years teaching others how to find the same peace. A thought to reflect on. Whether or not you believe in religion, consider this. If someone like that truly lived, And if his teachings have helped millions of people for over 2,500 years, isn't that worth exploring more deeply? In the next part, we'll dive into the historical and archaeological evidence of the Buddha's life. Where was he born? How do we know? And what does that tell us about the real person behind the image? Stay with me. Part 2. The historical footprints of a real man. In the first part, we asked, was the Buddha a real person, or just a legend? Now, let's explore the historical evidence, what we actually know, from solid sources, about his life and the world he lived in. A royal birth in ancient Lumbini. Historical sources agree that Siddhartha Gautama was born in Lumbini, a region that now lies within modern-day Nepal, around the 6th century BC. He belonged to the Sakya clan, a small noble group in the Himalayan foothills. His father was Suddhodana, a leader or chieftain, sometimes called a king in later texts, though the title is more symbolic than literal. His mother was Queen Maya, who, according to tradition, gave birth to him while holding onto the branch of a sal tree in Lumbini garden. The Ashoka pillar at Lumbini. This isn't just religious folklore. We have archaeological evidence to support it, most notably the Ashoka pillar. Around 249 BC, Emperor Ashoka, one of India's greatest historical figures, visited Lumbini during his pilgrimage to important Buddhist sites. He had a stone pillar erected there with an inscription in Brahmi script, which reads, in translation, "Here the Buddha, the sage of the Sakyas, was born." Inscription on the Lumbini pillar, 3rd century BC. This is a crucial detail. It tells us that by the 3rd century BC, just 200 years after the Buddha's passing, Lumbini was already recognized as his birthplace, and people were preserving his memory through physical monuments. Modern historians and archaeologists regard the Ashoka pillars as some of the most credible and datable evidence of early Buddhism. The Lumbini site has been excavated and verified by international research teams, including UNESCO. Other sites marked by Ashoka. Ashoka also marked other key locations in the Buddha's life, including Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree; Sarnath, where he gave his first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta; Kusinara, Kushinagar, where he passed away, Parinibbana. These sites are not random. They align with descriptions found in the Pali Canon, which further confirms that the early Buddhist community had preserved accurate oral histories well before they were ever written down. What do the scriptures say? According to the Vinaya Pitaka and Sutta Pitaka of the Pali Canon, compiled during the First Buddhist Council shortly after the Buddha's death, the life of Siddhartha Gautama was not filled with miracles, but with moments of deep insight, renunciation, and human struggle. He is described as a man who left behind a life of comfort after encountering the realities of old age, sickness, and death. He wandered as a seeker, trained under various teachers, and finally sat beneath the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, vowing not to rise until he discovered the truth. After attaining Bodhi, awakening, he spent 45 years teaching across northern India, forming the Sangha, a community of monks and nuns, and laying down a practical path to liberation. A remarkably human teacher. What's striking in the early texts is how earthly and realistic the Buddha is portrayed. He sweats when walking long distances. He gets tired, hungry, and even disciplines his followers when they quarrel. At times, he even falls sick, as recorded in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, DN 16. There's no need to turn him into a deity because what he accomplished as a human being is already extraordinary. Why this matters? It's important to know that we're not following a myth, but a teacher who actually lived, taught, and walked the earth. A man who observed life deeply enough to offer a path out of suffering based not on faith, but on experience. I teach suffering and the end of suffering. Makyahima Nikaya, Aman 22. This was his mission. Not to start a religion, not to be worshipped, but to share a way of seeing life clearly and freeing oneself from it. In the next part, we'll explore how and why the Buddha became a legendary figure over time, how stories of miracles and divine birth got layered over his very human journey, and what we can learn from both the facts and the myths. Part 3. Why did people turn the Buddha into a god? So far, we've seen that the Buddha Siddhartha Gautama was a real historical figure. He walked, taught, and lived as a human being. But then, why is it that in many stories, he's portrayed as someone born walking, taking 7 steps immediately after birth, with lotuses blooming under his feet? Why do some texts describe him as having supernatural powers, glowing with golden light, or speaking in divine verses? These stories are beautiful and poetic, but clearly, they are not literal history. So, what happened? The rise of myth and symbol. After the Buddha passed away around 400 BCE, his teachings were preserved orally, through chanting by his disciples. For the first few centuries, there were no written scriptures, and no images or statues of the Buddha. His presence was remembered through symbols, the Bodhi tree, an empty seat, or the wheel of Dhamma. But as Buddhism spread across India, then to Sri Lanka, China, Central Asia, and beyond, people from different cultures began to add their own beliefs, rituals, and symbolic elements. Over time, stories about the Buddha began to evolve. Devotion turned into deification. The Buddha himself rejected the idea of being worshipped. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, DN 16, shortly before his death, he reminded his followers, "Be islands unto yourselves. Be your own refuge, with no other refuge. Let the Dhamma be your refuge." But for many people, especially in later generations, devotion naturally turned into idealization and eventually into deification. This is something that happens in every spiritual tradition. Just like Confucius in China or Socrates in Greece, the original human teacher often becomes larger than life in the eyes of their followers. The stories were not meant to be literal. For example, the story of the Buddha walking 7 steps at birth and declaring, "I am the highest in the world," comes from later texts, such as the Lalitavistara Sutra, a Mahayana scripture written centuries after the Buddha's time. These stories were not meant to be historical biography. They were written as allegories to inspire faith and convey symbolic truths. The 7 steps represent transcendence over the 6 realms of existence in Buddhist cosmology. The lotus symbolizes purity in a world of suffering. The Buddha's golden aura expresses the idea of inner perfection, not physical reality. These are literary and devotional expressions, not eyewitness accounts. Why did this happen? There are several reasons. 1. Human nature craves the miraculous. People are drawn to stories of divine beings and miracles. It gives them comfort, especially in times of fear or uncertainty. 2. Cultural influence. As Buddhism spread into India, China, Tibet, Japan, and other regions, it absorbed local beliefs. Some traditions already had gods and mystical heroes, so they reimagined the Buddha in similar ways. 3. Emotional connection. Mythical stories are easier to remember and more emotionally powerful. They help people feel close to someone they never met. 4. Lack of literacy. In ancient times, most people couldn't read or study complex philosophy. Simple, miraculous stories were more accessible and easier to share. The Buddha never claimed to be a god. It's essential to return to the core of what the Buddha actually taught, especially as preserved in the Pali Canon. He referred to himself not as a savior or god, but as a Tathagata, a title meaning one who has gone to suchness, or simply, someone who has realized the truth. In the Majjhima Nikaya, Amman 26, he said, "I teach one thing and one thing only. Suffering and the end of suffering. That's it. No promises of salvation through faith. No requirement to worship Him. Just a practical path to be tested and experienced for yourself." So what should we make of the myths? We don't need to reject them entirely. These stories have inspired countless people and served as powerful metaphors for spiritual growth. But we should understand them for what they are. Poetry, not history. The Buddha didn't need magical powers to be extraordinary. His clarity of mind, compassion, and relentless honesty were already beyond what most of us achieve. He showed that a human being, with effort and insight, can overcome suffering and that you can, too. In the next part, we'll explore: how should we relate to the Buddha today? Should we bow to him, worship him, or follow his footsteps in daily life? Let's talk about what it really means to follow the Buddha in the 21st century beyond the statues and ceremonies. Part 4. How should we understand the Buddha today? Now that we've explored who the Buddha was and how his story evolved over time, let's ask the most important question. How should we relate to the Buddha today? Should we worship him? Should we just admire him from afar, as a historical figure? Or is there something deeper we can actually live by? The Buddha didn't want to be worshipped. This may surprise you, but according to the earliest records, the Buddha never asked anyone to worship him. In fact, he repeatedly said that the Dhamma, the teachings, was far more important than the person teaching it. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, DN 16, just before his death, he gave this final instruction: "What I have taught and explained to you, let that be your teacher after I am gone." It's a clear message. Don't cling to the man. Follow the path. The Buddha as a doctor, not a deity. One of the most powerful ways to understand the Buddha is this: he was like a doctor. He observed the disease, suffering, dukkha. He diagnosed its cause, craving, ignorance, attachment. He prescribed a treatment, the Noble Eightfold Path. And he encouraged each person to test the medicine themselves. Adipasiko, come and see for yourself. A phrase from early Buddhism, inviting direct experience. He didn't say, "Believe me or else." He said, "Try this path. See what happens." What it means to follow the Buddha today. To follow the Buddha today doesn't mean dressing like a monk or chanting in ancient languages. It means something much simpler and much harder. To live mindfully, instead of on autopilot. To observe our craving and reactions, instead of being ruled by them. To choose compassion over anger, wisdom over ignorance. It's not about believing in reincarnation. It's not about bowing to statues. It's about waking up to how we suffer and how we can be free. His teachings are still relevant because suffering is still real. Even after 2,500 years, the Buddha's teachings are not outdated. Why? Because the human condition hasn't changed. We still cling to what we like. We still fear what we cannot control. We still suffer from loss, confusion, loneliness, and stress. Whether you're rich or poor, religious or not, these truths remain. The Buddha wasn't offering blind faith. He was offering tools for mental clarity and emotional peace, accessible to anyone willing to look inward. You don't need to be a monk. The Buddha didn't teach only monks or nuns. In many suttas, he teaches farmers, workers, kings, mothers, and merchants. He tailored his message to real people with real lives. And many of his disciples, like Visakha, a wealthy laywoman, or Siddha the householder, became enlightened without ever leaving home. So yes, you, living your life today, with bills, relationships, and responsibilities, you can still walk this path. A final thought. The Buddha may have lived 2,500 years ago. But if you've ever felt overwhelmed by life, asked what's the point of all this, wanted real peace, not just temporary comfort, then the Buddha is speaking directly to you. By oneself is evil done. By oneself is one defiled. By oneself is evil left undone. By oneself is purified. Purity and impurity depend on oneself. No one can purify another. Dhammapada, verse 165. You don't have to believe in anything supernatural. You don't have to change who you are. All you need is a willingness to look within. That's where the path begins. And that's what it truly means to follow the Buddha. Folded hands. Thank you for watching. If this message resonated with you, consider exploring more of the Buddha's original teachings. Not for religion, not for ritual, but for the chance to live with clarity, peace, and freedom right here, right now.